Okay, welcome to part 2 of our 2-part series on discipline and accountability in coaching. In today's episode, we're going to jump back into some other common discipline scenarios. Last episode, just to recap, we unpacked how to address players talking while we are talking, showing up late, and poor body language. And more importantly, we unpacked the principles of transformational discipline. And I just want to take a few minutes to recap those, some of these important principles underlying transformational discipline, because it's really the understanding of principles that's most important. Obviously, the examples that we're giving here help you to understand how those principles are applied. Now, one of the most important principles is around transformational discipline. It comes back to why most accountability is ineffective in the long term. It's because most accountability that I see out there, it focuses on behavior change rather than mindset change. Accountability, it so often revolves around just compliance, like instead and getting them to do what we want them to do, instead of just an individual actually taking ownership and really understanding what's the problem for them. Another important principle that we discuss comes back to the quote former guest of the podcast, Dr. Jane Nelson, says in her books and on the podcast, which is, where do we ever get the crazy idea that in order to make people do better, we need to first make them feel worse? Where do we ever get the crazy idea that in order to make people do better, we first need to make them feel worse? Like when we hold athletes accountable with punishment, I think that's what we're trying to do, is oftentimes make them feel bad about their behavior so they'll change. And yet when we hold athletes accountable, when we discipline, we need to discipline to teach, not just to punishment. And so this is where we need to move from punishment to consequence is. So what's the difference between punishment and consequences? Well, punishment feels imposed. It happens to the individual. We punish them. It's about making them feel bad for their actions, so they change. Consequences feel like a result of their own choices. The individual understands they did it to themselves. It still might feel uncomfortable. It still might be painful. They might feel bad, but they chose that consequence. It's not that we are making them feel bad. Now, there are two main types of consequences. I discussed this in the culture system, the book, and also in the Transformational Coaching and Culture Certification course. We train the coaches up on this when you go through that certification. But there's two main types of consequences, natural and logical consequences. So natural consequences, they happen organically without interference. For example, if you don't bring an umbrella, you get wet, right? Like that's a natural consequence. If my kid doesn't bring their jacket, they go to school and they're cold, like I let them experience the natural consequences of not being responsible, right? Logical consequences, they're designed consequences that help individuals learn. So for instance, if you're late or you miss practice, you have makeup work because you are late or you missed practice. You missed some learning, you missed some conditioning, you missed some improvement on some of your skills. Now, there are three main types of logical consequences. These are important to remember. So when we're brainstorming consequences that we could use, there's the fix it, which is encouraging players to make amends for their actions. There's the timeout, which is a temporary removal from the group. And oftentimes this provides opportunities for reflection or resetting themselves or self-correcting. Okay. And then there's the last one is the loss of privilege. And this is taking away certain rights or opportunities due to behavior. And I really think when it comes to sports, the loss of privilege, not necessarily a right, it's just an opportunity, because sports are a privilege. They are not something that they're entitled to. All right, enough review. Today is really about unpacking some more scenarios related to how to hold athletes accountable when an athlete talks poorly about a teammate or coach, talks back to a coach, isn't giving effort in a drill or a game, or ignores a teammate or coach, disrespects a teacher or professor or somebody in the community, misses practices, team meetings, or team culture time. And lastly, bullying. We talk about that. So I work through 8 different scenarios in today's episode. Now, I know you've all experienced some or potentially all of these challenges. And so I'm really, really confident you're going to find today's episode really practical and informative. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nerman. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. Our mission here on this podcast is simple. We want to help coaches become better leaders and build better team cultures. If you're interested in learning more about our work as leadership coaches and facilitators, or if you want to explore our online courses and books, head on over to tocculture.com and betsybutterick.com. While you're at tocculture.com, don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter It's packed with notes from each podcast episode, our latest articles, and practical culture building tips. Also, just one more thing, and I mentioned this the last episode. This is a great one to share, not just with your fellow coaches, but even with your players. Share it and have a conversation around accountability, what that looks like in your team. This helps players understand maybe why you don't yell and scream and do all those other crazy things that we did when we were really transactional as a coach, or hey, we fall back into from time to time. We all do it. That's okay, right? But this is a great episode to share with even your athletes, especially your leadership council. All right, so let's get right back into our conversation. Myself, Betsy, and Nate, and this is the second part of that conversation.
Okay, so the next one is talking poorly about a teammate, coach, or the team. I often think of this as gossiping behind people's back, talking poorly in the locker room, right? The things that oftentimes we may not even sometimes hear as coaches. Betsy, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, we need to do like a separate podcast for this probably. This is a big one for me, and I can say it's a trigger for me. I may have some visible body language in response to when I hear or observe these situations happening, primarily because it's a choice. Choosing to talk about someone, especially when we choose to talk about them and also make the choice never to talk to them about whatever issue we are gossiping about or talking about with other people. It's a choice. So it's controllable. And I understand that people need to process, or there might be a felt need to process with other people about a situation that we find challenging that involves somebody that's not in the space, but it is a choice. And we can make the choice to never speak about someone who's not present in specific ways. So for me personally, every conversation I have, I act as if that conversation is being recorded. Anybody that I talk about, I pretend as if, even though that person is not there, that they can hear me. So these are choices that we can make that influence the way that we speak about other people, especially when those other people aren't in the room. And when we talk about consequences, it's like, okay, accountability for your words, and just being aware that your words have a history. And in working with teams, especially on culture, one of the phrases I say often is that the stories that we tell become the culture that we keep. What you choose to talk about when you leave practice with teammates in the locker room, with parents when you have a phone call, with roommates or friends and other teams, the stories that you tell, what moment of practice are you choosing to speak about? Is it a negative one? Was it a positive one? Are you talking about somebody like your coach? Or, the stories that we tell become the culture that we keep. Translation for an individual, the words that we choose to say, specifically about other people, especially when those people are not present, become part of how others view us. It's related to our own personal integrity. And so we are creating or shaping a brand, if you will, by what we choose to say and to speak into existence. So being very conscious of and responsible for our words that we say, acting as if whoever we're talking about can hear us. And if they were present, would that be what you are comfortable saying, or would you maybe make a different choice? That's what comes up for me often.
Yeah, and I guess one of the challenges in this is how do we address that? How do we hold athletes accountable for these things they're saying behind others' backs, that kind of come back to us? I think the hard part for us as coaches is this is like more of like, it's less obvious. Like a player's late, oh, they're late, right? A player is by body language, we can put that on camera. But someone's speaking poorly about another person, it kind of comes back to us through secondhand, third-hand information. I think it becomes really challenging.
JP, this one is slippery because, like you said, hearsay is not necessarily always, the most accurate evidence that somebody has actually said those things, or in the way that they were perceived, or in the way that they're arriving in your email box or at your doorstep, right? And I've always been hesitant to respond to something that I can't necessarily prove, because I think that opens up a whole bunch of other doors that can, be difficult to navigate as a coach as well. So in a situation like this, oftentimes I'm going to confront that player. I'm going to do some research. Obviously, you're going to ask around, talk to captains. What are the assistant coaches hearing? That sort of thing, to try to find a pattern of behavior. And then we're going to try to have a conversation it's probably going to be rooted in, again, what's causing this for them, what are their frustrations. And for me, it's really going to bring them back to the idea that the reason that we have assistant coaches and team captains and one-on-ones is because we want to create channels for these frustrations to be handled and be dealt with. Like, if there's something that someone else is doing, whatever the cause is, we want to help be able to move forward, whatever that attention needs, for the betterment of the team, right? And so there probably will be a consequence. I mean, I remember an example of a teammate putting one, or a player putting their teammate on blast in a group chat with their club team. And of course, then that gets screenshotted and sent around, and obviously gets back to me. So that's a little bit different because, as you said, that's on camera. Now we have some evidence. But the consequence of that was, we talked about just the violation of trust, in terms of what that communicated to the rest of the team. And so her penalty was, I gave her 15 little cards of appreciation and the mailing address of all 15 of her teammates. And I said, until you can write a note of appreciation and learn to recognize what's good in your teammates, and send these in the mail, your parents will verify that you mailed them, you're not eligible to play. So that was part of her consequence. And then she sat 2 games as a result of that as well. But again, I go back to, like, there's a piece of punishment, discipline, accountability, whatever, that also has to involve restoration, right? Like, how does she rebuild trust? And in some ways, I don't know exactly what was written in all of those, but I'm always thinking about that as well. I'm protecting the culture and the standards, but I'm also trying to find a way for this player to be restored to the team so that we can move forward as a whole again. And that's difficult.
Yeah. I think one of the accountability things you just talked about there that's just has to be established is that we're going to talk things out here, right? If I hear something, I'm going to kind of address it, and I'm going to try to have conversations that bring things forward. So it could be wrong. It could just be hearsay. It could be rumors, or that you're spreading rumors or talking poorly, but we're going to just talk things out in this team. Like, establishing that type of culture is really important. I think this is also where a player-led versus a coach-led team is really important, and having a leadership council that brings issues. Hey, what issues are you having with the people in your units this week? Well, what issues are they having? Well, Jane is speaking badly about, player over here. Like, those types of bringing those things to the surface, is really important, and that can help us to identify those issues. But I think really what you talked about there is the restoration piece, Nate. And these are ones where I'd say, hey, what's really the issue here? Like, what is causing this problem, for this person, that they would want to be saying these things, having a conversation to help them, articulate that, and then think, okay, what's a better way for you to communicate that frustration, work with them on that. And also, okay, what you've done has been hurtful, right? It's breaking trust within the team. It's hurting our culture. So what are some things that you can do to show your teammates that you value this culture and that you're actually sorry, like, for what you did here? And so it's not enough just to say, I'm sorry. Like, you have to do something, whether it's to write the notes. I've seen players that have, gotten into stuff with another player and said some things, and, well, those players worked out together for a whole week after practice, like they spent more time together in that setting. So trying to find some sort of restoration, but the more we can bring the athlete into that solution-based consequence, that restorative consequence, the more it's going to feel like a consequence than a penalty. But obviously, there are certain situations where their penalties do have to be enacted. Schools require penalties, for certain things, the suspensions, right? But just because you have a penalty, you sit and suspend a girl, doesn't mean there shouldn't be a restorative consequence as well. Okay, last one before we get you out of here. And I think these have been so good. So I know this is a bit of a longer episode, but I think coaches are going to find a lot of value in it. And this is one that comes up a lot, which is just athletes that talk back. How do we handle when we're coaching in practice or in a game, we're giving instruction, we're giving the athlete feedback, we're telling them what they could do better, and they are constantly coming up and defending, making excuses, or just even straight out defiant towards our coaching? How do we handle that?
I'm going to be the advocate for some pre-work here again. Again, addressing issues before they become problems. So sometimes we don't know that we have an athlete that talks back until the first time it happens. And the first time it happens becomes the starting point for that conversation if it hasn't already happened. If I was doing pre-work with a team, let's say I don't yet know if I have an athlete who talks back or not, or several, I might say, look, in our sport experience, it's very likely that there are going to be times where we disagree. I might give you feedback that you don't feel is fair or appropriate. Those are conversations that I want to have. And it's not always the most appropriate time in the moment to have those conversations. So if something doesn't land well with you, or if you have questions about something and it needs to be a longer conversation, here's how and when we can have that conversation, or here's how you can let me know. So when an athlete talks back, pausing in the moment to say, hold on, it sounds like there's a miscommunication here. This is important for us to address. Right now, I need to get back to what we're doing as a team, but I will come back to this conversation. So making an acknowledgement, making a plan for follow-up, also articulating that you can't continue to go back and forth with an athlete because it's detrimental to everybody else. When that person has your unique time and attention in an unproductive way, the team suffers. And so even just setting a ground rule of like, we're not going to, talking back to a coach is an inappropriate way to express a frustration or a lack of understanding, or to show that you disagree with something. The disagreeing is okay. Here's what's not okay. And here's how you can appropriately handle situations when you disagree or have something that you wish to share. So outlining not just here's what you can't do or here's what we won't accept, but when this happens, which it may, here's the ways that you can appropriately address the situation. Because if I've had that pre-conversation before anything happens, it's much easier in the moment when disrespect is shown or an athlete talks back to say, okay, pause. This is one of those times. We will continue talking about this. We're not going to talk about it now because of what we need to do with the team. I will circle back with you, or whatever we've put in place. So before it happens, setting some ground rules. When it happens, acknowledging that this is one of those times, and then continuing to move forward with the agenda as defined. You may find athletes that are resistant. They blow through that. They're like, no, we're going to talk about it now. You feel like you can call me out in front of the team. I'm going to come back at you. So they may continue, and we may need to take further action of saying, look, I understand this is upsetting. I'm going to ask that you step off because this is not what we need to focus on right now. Not you are not important, or not you, I'm not going to listen to you, but we may need to have more immediate, I'll say, consequences, such as removal from the group or the situation, in order to start to reinforce more productive choices for how they can handle moments where they would otherwise talk back.
JP, in the classroom when I was a teacher, I would just tell them, write it down and put it in the comment box. We're moving on. And some of them would scribble like crazy for the rest of class and then drop it in this box. And then I'd throw it away so there was never any evidence and we'd move on. But, I do think one thing, Betsy, and you touched on this many times, JP, so I won't beat it to death here. But if we start from a place where practice is a privilege, and in order to earn the privilege to practice, there are certain standards and non-negotiables that everybody is expected to adhere to, and mutual respect, I'm sure, is one that all of us as coaches can agree upon, and that's going to be a tripwire for me, quite honestly. Like, if you're going to be disrespectful to a coach or to another player in practice, you're going to very quickly lose the privilege of being able to continue, at least in the short term. Doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to send them home or kick them out or something like that. But we're not going to allow that. I mean, I'm going to give them grace, kind of as Betsy, modeled there or talked about. But at the end of the day, that kind of behavior disqualifies them from that privilege, and we're not afraid to pull that trigger when it's necessary.
This is really, really important. And we've actually had a list of like 16 behaviors here that are common and issues, from disrespecting officials to not sprinting back on defense to talking back to coaches, or those types of things. And this is probably the most transformational discipline approach that I've taken, which is offer support through pre-conversations when appropriate and when you have the time and the moment. Yes, players talks back to you, say, all right, everybody keep working here. Let's talk for a second here. But the reality is, as coaches, we don't always have that time, right? We have a duty to the team, and it's adding more problems. So it's just can be simply, hey, we're not going to have this conversation here. We could talk about it after practice, or we could talk about the water break, or just step off until you're ready to be coached. As soon as you're ready to step in and be coached and be at our standards, great. But also the preloaded, to Betsy's point of like, I am willing to have conversations. We're just not going to have these conversations in this moment when you're triggered, because so often they're defensive because they're already triggered. And so by trying to have a conversation that moment, it really is just not effective, productive. Some players, they go take have a water, they step off for a drill, 5 minutes later, they're good to go. Some, they have to wait till the next day, right? They're just never going to get to that place. And that honestly, that's okay, right? I think what we've seen time and time again is those coaches that have said, all right, you've just lost the opportunity to get better today. You've lost the privilege of practice. That time and time again, this starts to change the mindset of the whole team. And all of a sudden, you are not chasing down this behavior or that behavior. You've changed the mindset of, we get to be here. This is an opportunity to get better. We need to practice because if we want to be successful. We don't have to practice. We need to practice. We get to practice. And so it comes back to the mindset shift.
At the end of the day, JP, I think one other place where coaches can get better is just taking responsibility for those moments. So often we get triggered as coaches and then we blame the kid and then we try to correct the behavior so that I can get back to my job as a coach, and I miss an opportunity. And not only do I miss it, but I don't take responsibility for it, for maybe where I went wrong and didn't communicate enough up front. Maybe my expectations weren't clear. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I did something that caused, a reaction. But this should be a collective endeavor. It's me and the player trying to work forward, right? And so often coaches just blame the player, and that's not going to get them where they want to go either. So we've got to take responsibility and ownership of what we're trying to do with the player to move them and the team forward.
All right, so after recording this episode, I felt like, wow, we really didn't get to cover even half the scenarios or case studies I wanted to. So I thought it really might be worthwhile for me to just spend, the next 5-10 minutes here to talk through a few more, because I think for a lot of us, examples help us to understand how to apply the principles. So I'm going to run through a few more with all of you today. All right, let's start with players not giving effort on a drill or enough effort in practice, right? First, before you hold them accountable, and this is really on all of these things, I think you could see this in our conversation with Betsy and Nate, but is like, have you set the standard? Have you established standards? So you go back to the culture system, establish the culture, support the culture, enforce the culture. Establish standards, support the standards, enforce the standards. So have you established the standard? And have you offered support? Or do you have the opportunity to offer support? Like, you can't always offer support in certain contexts. But check in with them and ask what's going on. If you have that opportunity, there's a lot of value in that. Now, there's a lot of context that could inform this decision, but a logical consequence for not enough effort is oftentimes a good one. And a do-over is a great one for the individual, or a reset for the team. So just ask the player to do the drill or the rep again, or reset the drill and ask the whole team to start over again and do it at the standard that you all have set. Like, this is just a really good first progression of a consequence. Recently, even just coaching young kids, I had a player who's goofing off, and I had offered, a few times, hey, to redo. Now, they chose to not get it together. So I actually asked this young man to say, step off, right? Now, I actually had to step into the drill, and I was working with his partner who was also struggling a little bit with his focus, but I actually had a lot of fun with the partner and did a few reps. And then I came back to this young man, about 5 minutes later, and asked, hey, are you ready to join practice and do it at our standard? And he said, absolutely. Now, great thing was there was no issues the rest of the training. And this kid knows next time I point this out, like he's losing focus, he knows, like, I mean business. So I highly recommend doing this instead of making a kid run or yelling at a player. Just kindly let them know if they don't pick it up, they will sit out. And what we're teaching our athletes in this moment is that practice is a privilege. They should want to be in the drill. They should want to be having those opportunities to get better. Another one is not giving effort in the game. And it's very similar to practice, but still, this is also very hard because it's very contextual to the sport. Like sports like basketball and ice hockey, for instance, they have more substitutions, especially ice hockey. So it's a bit easier to pull a player when they aren't giving great effort. Other sports with limited substitutions, they require maybe more reminders before you pull the athlete. But this is why I think, holding really, really high standards of effort in a practice is important, because then it's less of an issue in a game. Like, if you're not holding really high standards in practice, well, you're more likely to experience that problem in a game, and vice versa. So if you really hold high standards of practice, you're less likely to see a dip in effort. Now, at the same time, if your sport allows, you could use progressive consequences, like in ice hockey or basketball, or depending on the league that you're playing in, just by pulling the athlete. And the first progression would be just pulling them and allowing them to self-correct their effort. I mean, you might even allow them to put themselves back in, to sub themselves back in when they believe they are ready. Now, if they don't fix it, then you might sit them for a certain period of time, or even it might move to a point of like, hey, the rest of the game. We've had a few situations, this was more like the collegiate level, but a player's attitude and behavior on the bench was so unacceptable that coaches had to say, hey, we need you to head to the locker room. But like typically this isn't an issue when the culture is good, the support is high for the athletes, and other progressive measures are being taken consistently. Now, let's get into another one, which is ignoring a teammate or coach. Like I far too often see this. I know coaches observe this, like a player walks into practice or a team meeting or a locker room, and they're just totally into themselves or their clique. They ignore teammates, coaches, or even managers just walking right past them. Or maybe the player or players come in with a lack of urgency, right? They're just putzing around and they're not getting in there and not being focused. A simple way to do this for the player or even the team, like a team walks in the weight room, just all lackadaisical, is to just have them fix their behavior. Ask the player to walk out of the gym or the team to walk out and do it again. And this time, have everyone talk and touch, have some sense of urgency. It can be annoying. It can be a little embarrassing for them. It can seem a little bit trivial, but it gives them reps doing it right. And this is so much more effective in the long term than a lecture. Just ask them to do it again and say, hey, we're going to do this until we do it right. Disrespecting a teacher, professor, or even just someone in the community. I mean, we've had this issues with some of the teams that coaches I work with. They've had issues with this, the high school and college teams, where their behavior, one of the athletes' behavior in the community is brought to the coach. Now, one simple consequence is just loss of privilege to practice that day. It might seem a little bit punitive, but when it's established beforehand, it's a consequence, right? Like, hey, playing sports is not a right; it's a privilege. You need to do your schoolwork. You need to come in. You need to show up. You need to be at our standards. If you don't do that, then you lose the privilege that day. So there's actually been a few cases. I've had coaches who've become aware that of player behavior issues in the classroom that are severe and prolonged and significant. Now, what they've done in those situations is they let that athlete know that if a teacher has another issue, they'll miss out on practice that day. And some of these cases, the athlete actually had to, this was I think at the high school level, bring a daily card. It had to be initialed by the teachers. And like this might seem extreme, like to have this senior or junior in high school having to get the card initialed for good behavior. But the idea was if they didn't get initial for one class, and they might miss like say 20 minutes of practice that day, they'd have to sit out. And the alternative, though, was the school was suggesting removing the kid from the team and potentially even the school. So this actually was a bit of a progression, right? Rather than just like, up, you're off the team, or up, you're out of the school. And it was actually really, really effective. When serious behavior issues arise, I really wouldn't stop with a loss of practice or practice time. I would sit down and ask the athlete, hey, what can you do to make this right? Like, because oftentimes they've hurt, been disrespectful. And so I've had situations where an athlete had cleaned the classroom of a teacher, or they wrote an apology letter, or they just committed to sitting in the front of the classroom and being engaged and participating the next week, or just trying to help that teacher or somebody else out in the community in some other way. All right, missing practices, team meetings, or team culture time. This is always a challenging one, especially because, how legitimate is their excuse or their reason? I like to say I'm not going to get caught up in how legitimate or illegitimate their reason or excuse is. At the end of the day, you miss work, like you have makeup work, right? You miss school, you have makeup work. You miss practice, well, you should have makeup work. So miss a game or practice, you should be watching films or doing up makeup drills or doing some individual work. You miss team time, hey, go read a chapter of a book or listen to a podcast that could be beneficial for that athlete. And then do a little report for the team and have that athlete share with the team what they learned about leadership, culture, or whatever the topic was that you picked out for them. It's really simple. Like when people miss, just ask, what do they miss and how can they make it up? Right? Now, don't try to avoid, the physical conditioning lectures or penalties or, just kind of blowing up the team, those types of things. Speaking of penalties, bullying as a teammate is a common kind of challenge or behavior thing that you might see in certain teams. And oftentimes for something like bullying, there needs to be a penalty like suspension. And that's natural. Like our institutions and organizations, they require it. But don't stop there. When something like bullying or a fight between teammates happens, there's a rupture in the relationship. So the question is, how can you repair that rupture? If you read the culture system, you'll remember that story of the Cubs manager Joe Madden. Like Joe Madden would have players pick a piece of paper with the name of a wine, a nice wine. He loves wine, but they'd have him pick that paper from the fishbowl, and the player would have to go then buy the wine and drink it with Joe. The idea is, it's reconnecting, repairing the rupture, and building the relationship. So here, think about how they can spend time together. Maybe the restorative consequence is they room together, they have to do a workout together, they sit together on a bus, or they have to go out to lunch and learn about each other. Like, don't just rely on the penalty. And this is one of the other benefits, and I don't think I've, really reinforced this enough, but like punishment, is so much focused on, making them feel bad for what they've did. It's transactional type discipline. It's just very much about compliance, whereas transformational discipline is about character growth. It's about nurturing intrinsic motivation, all these good things, not just compliance. It's also about relationships. Like in transformational discipline, so often what happens is the relationship's stronger than ever, right? Like that, there was that, the moment where the two athletes fight or the player lashes out and, at a coach, instead of the relationship deteriorating even further, it becomes this break that then is corrected and repaired. And then the relationship is stronger than it was before. You almost are grateful that you had this opportunity, that this player, did something wrong, right? It's kind of like the broken bone thing. You break a bone and, oftentimes it heals back stronger than before. I think I've heard that before. Like this is the relationship aspect of this. So relationally transformational discipline is a game changer. And all of these examples, always try to find ways to support, to have conversations with the athletes, to help coach them on really what's going on for them, coach them on their mindset, not just the behavior change. And so often with the mindset, it's just helping them become aware of the natural consequences of their actions, right? And then you got to hold them accountable, because as Dr. Henry Cloud says, we change our behavior when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. Consequences give us the pain that motivates us to change. All right, that's enough on discipline. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you enjoy our content, you might have thought about how else TOC can help you, your team, your organization. Since 2017, I've been coaching and consulting on team culture, leadership, and character development in sports. I work with teams, club, athletic departments, even schools to develop stronger cultures and better coaches through our online courses, on-site facilitation, and one-on-one coaching. If that sounds like something your organization needs, you can reach out to see if we're a good fit. Just head on over to tocculture.com. Thanks for tuning in to the Coaching Culture Podcast. If you found this valuable, we'd love for you to leave a review, but most of all, share it with your athletes, fellow coaches, and friends. These episodes make for great conversation starters. And remember, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes of the Coaching Culture Podcast.